Just like that, 2024 is now behind us. But unfortunately, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not. We are fast approaching the third year of Putin's unprovoked invasion. The notable thing is that for the first time in a while, the information space regarding the war was dominated by discussions of diplomatic resolution rather than developments on the battlefield. Welcome to another update on the war in Ukraine. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. Before we go on to talk about diplomacy, let's dive into the situation on the battlefield. In terms of a bird's eye view, not much has changed. The Russians are still advancing, or trying to advance, on numerous fronts and axes. The biggest difference is that in December, their pace of advance slowed down a little bit. But in Donbass, a very problematic situation continues to develop for Ukraine. The Russians have gained ground on the flanks of the Velika Novosilka sector. In the north, the 336th Marine Brigade captured Novy Kamar, cutting one of the Ukrainian supply lines. In the southwest, the 60th Motor Rifle Brigade seized Makarivka, Blahodeshna, and Storozheva, fast approaching the only remaining supply line to the west of Velika Novosilka. Here, the situation is desperate for the Ukrainian army, and there is a very high chance that they will have to give up Velika Novosilka in the coming weeks. In the Kurakova sector, the Russians gained ground in the south, north, and the central axes. In the south, they captured Zelenivka, Sukiyeli, Konstantinopolska, and Trudova. On the central axis, at one point they encircled the Ukrainian unit in Hanivka and Uspanivka, and it seems like at least some Ukrainian soldiers have been taken prisoner. Most importantly, the Russian 5th Motor Rifle Brigade has captured Kurakova, the largest town in this sector. In the north, the Russians captured Sontsivka and Stary Terny. The Russian army has also seized ground south and southwest of Pokrovsk. They advance from Zhovta to Shevchenko and Pischana towards the north, and on to Solona and Uspanivka towards the west. They have also captured ground along the E50 highway, reaching Dechenska. The Russian movement clearly demonstrates that they intend to advance on the T0406 highway to cut one of the supply lines to Pokrovsk, along with advancing along the E50 to launch a frontal assault on Pokrovsk. The Russians will likely attempt to cut the T0504 highway as well, in order to eventually attack Pokrovsk from 3 sides, stretching the Ukrainian defenses as they did in Bakhmut. A difficult situation persists on the Kupiansk front as well. The Russians are not giving up on their attempts to create a bridgehead to the west of the Oskil River. Earlier they gained a foothold in Novomalinsk, but in early December the Ukrainian army forced them to withdraw. However, on December 1st, the Russians crossed the river on boats near Masyutivka and have since advanced on Dvorichna. As of late December, the Ukrainians have not been able to defeat this Russian bridgehead yet, and they continue bringing more infantry west of the Oskil. The Ukrainian command has to find a way to defeat the bridgehead, or at least contain it, otherwise they will lose the defensive advantage of the Oskil River. On the Zaporizhia and Kherson fronts, the status quo has persisted since the Ukrainian 2023 summer counter-offensive, but Ukrainian commanders are ringing the alarm bells. The commander of the 3rd National Guard Brigade warned about the massing of enemy equipment and troops in Zaporizhia. The head of the Kherson military administration, Prokudin, has issued a similar warning. He stated that Russia has prepared 300 boats to cross the Dnipro. They have also increased the frequency of attacks on the islands of the Dnipro, along with constantly targeting ordinary civilians with FPV drones in Kherson. Earlier, the Ukrainians failed to make something out of their Krinky bridgehead, and unless the Russians are ready to risk a huge number of men and equipment, they will face similar difficulties. In Kursk, Russia has continued expending considerable resources to regain the Ukraine-controlled area, but they have only succeeded in recapturing some ground around Novy-Ivanovka and Pekovo. We have seen footage of crazy and costly infantry charges, which many sources claim North Koreans carried out. There are many reports about heavy losses suffered by the North Koreans already. On December 23rd, Zelensky claimed that 3,000 North Koreans had already been killed and wounded in Kursk, while the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff reported a more modest figure of 1,100 losses. Different sources suggest that North Korea is going to send even more troops on top of their reported 12,000, as their military cooperation with Russia is becoming closer. According to Ukrainian sources, North Korea is supplying 60% of artillery and mortar shells that Russia uses in Ukraine, along with 1/3 of missiles. The Wall Street Journal reports that this is done in exchange for Russian military technology, oil, and money. And where does Russia get the money, despite being under heavy Western sanctions? Well, mostly from gas and oil, since not all countries have joined sanctions against Russia. For instance, Reuters reported that in December, the Russian state oil company Rosneft and India's refining company Reliance Industries signed a 10-year deal whereby Russia will give 500,000 barrels of oil daily in exchange for approximately $13 billion. And despite the troubling time that the Russian economy is going through right now, energy revenues allow them to keep their military machine going. According to the Associated Press, Russia has increased its military budget to $145 billion for 2025, which will make up a whopping 32.5% of overall spending. Such levels of spending have enabled Russia to continue producing weapons and equipment and recruiting more and more men to fight in Ukraine. Take the words of any Russian official with a grain of salt, but according to the Russian Minister of Defense, Belousov, more than 427,000 men have signed contracts with the Russian army to fight in Ukraine. That is more than 1,000 people per day. More than 1,000 people per day are ready to kill or die in this war of aggression. For money, for status, due to ideological beliefs, regardless, it tells you all you need to know about the current state of Russian society. The energy revenues also allow Russia to produce drones and missiles to continue terrorizing Ukrainian citizens, trying to break their will to fight. According to CNN, the Shahed drone manufacturing plant in Alabuga produced almost 6,000 drones between January and September 2024. The Ukrainian military intelligence representative Yusov claimed that Russia can produce 40 to 50 Iskander missiles, 30 to 50 Kalibr missiles, and 50 Kh-101 missiles per month. On December 12th, Russia conducted their largest missile and drone attack since the start of the war. The Ukrainian Air Force reported 94 Russian missiles and 193 drones being launched on energy and other critical infrastructure in Kyiv, Odessa, Chernihiv, Lviv, and other oblasts, causing temporary blackouts across Ukraine. Russia carried out 2 more major air attacks on December 20th and 24th. However, long-range strikes are now a game that two can play, as Ukraine has developed its long-range strike capability with domestically produced drones. They conducted notable drone attacks in December on military and civilian infrastructure in Bryansk Oblast, Taganrog, Grozny, and Kazan. Since we mentioned Grozny, we need to talk about a shocking episode that concerns a third side. On December 25th, an Azerbaijani Airlines passenger aircraft was shot at over the skies of Chechnya. The damaged plane was able to reach the airport in Akatau, Kazakhstan, where it crash-landed, causing the death of 38 people. There is widespread consensus that Russian air defenses somehow confused the Azerbaijani commercial airplane with a Ukrainian drone and hit the airplane with a missile. This is the second time Russia has downed a commercial airplane since the start of the war in Ukraine. Long-range strikes are one of the main tools of asymmetric warfare conducted by both sides in this war. Targeted assassinations are another one. Ukraine's special services have targeted collaborators and Russian military commanders several times throughout this war, and on December 17th, the commander of the Russian Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Defense Troops, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, was killed by an exploding scooter in Moscow, a day after Ukraine charged him with the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine. However, while Ukraine has been successful with asymmetric warfare, its conventional warfare situation continues to remain problematic, as evidenced by Russia's advances. Russia's manpower advantage remains the biggest problem for Ukraine. According to the Financial Times, Ukrainian authorities have launched 60,000 cases against Ukrainian soldiers for desertion. The main causes are lack of rotation and exhaustion of soldiers, which indicates insufficient manpower reserves. The BBC quoted a representative of the Ukrainian Chief of Staff, who said that the current rates of mobilization are not enough even to cover their losses. The manpower problem of the Ukrainian army often leads to discussions of the necessity to lower the mobilization age, which the Ukrainian government is reluctant to do, to avoid making the country's demographic situation even worse. Still, it is reportedly urged by Kyiv's Western allies. Given Ukraine's dependence on foreign military aid, one may wonder if the Ukrainian leadership will eventually budge from their position on this matter. Germany remains Ukraine's second-largest military supporter, and in December they pledged 2 Patriot and 2 Iris-T air defense systems, 15 Leopard 1 tanks, 2 Gepard vehicles, 30 MRAP vehicles, dozens of drones, and thousands of shells, while the German military manufacturer Rheinmetall will supply 155mm artillery shells. The United States, of course, is the largest military donor to Ukraine, and the Biden administration is scrambling to deliver as much aid as possible before the unpredictable Trump presidency starts. On December 2nd, they announced a $725 million military aid package consisting of HIMARS ammunition, hundreds of thousands of pieces of artillery ammunition, NASAMS munitions, Javelin anti-tank guns, Stinger missiles, and so on. A couple of days later, Secretary of State Blinken stated that Ukraine would get $50 billion from the proceeds of frozen Russian assets. On December 7th, the Americans pledged more HIMARS ammunition, unspecified drones, equipment and spare parts for tanks, armored vehicles and artillery systems worth almost $1 billion. On the other hand, Ukraine should not expect to get more ATACMS missiles on top of the 500 they had reportedly received, according to the New York Times. American officials told the New York Times that Ukraine has about 50 more ATACMS missiles. This is an unfortunate development for Kyiv, since, thanks also to the use of ATACMS missiles, the Russians have been forced to relocate some of their aircraft away from the front line, which has decreased the frequency of their usage of very effective glide bombs. Other reports of foreign aid to Ukraine include the delivery of an unspecified number of F-16s by Denmark, almost $600 million from Canada for military and humanitarian needs, a pledge of €1.5 billion of aid per month from the EU, and a £225 million British pledge to support Ukraine's navy and counter-drone capacity. At this point, momentum for peace talks is building, with the warring sides and others with a stake in this war making their positions clear. Zelensky has ruled out capitulation, and indeed, for all the problems Ukraine is currently having on the battlefield, the Ukrainian army remains a very capable force, fighting for every inch of their land. But he has conceded that Ukraine does not have enough to get back their lands. Zelensky is seeking real security guarantees to make sure that if he agrees to freeze the war with Russia, Putin would not just use the time to regroup and attack once again in a couple of years. Of course, NATO membership is the ultimate security guarantee, and Zelensky has suggested a route whereby Ukraine would join NATO, but Article 5 would not apply until the end of the war. Trump's special envoy Keith Kellogg's purported peace plan has been reported in the media. It envisages the end of Russia's isolation by the West and the restoration of diplomatic relations. The idea is to encourage Russia into sincere peace talks by guaranteeing postponement of Ukraine's NATO membership for 10 years, by gradually lifting sanctions and not objecting to Russia keeping the occupied lands without officially recognizing Moscow's legitimacy over them. Ukraine will be motivated by continued military aid and bilateral security guarantees with the United States. If Kyiv refuses these terms, the United States may consider stopping military aid. If Moscow refuses to talk, then the military aid will increase. It is speculated that the hostilities will stop on the current front lines. It would turn into a demilitarized zone, which European troops may man, to ensure that the war does not flare up again. So, in a nutshell, it looks a lot like the deal which ended the Korean War. The priority is to stop the war and make sure it does not happen again. Ukraine gets security guarantees similar to that of South Korea, and let the political resolution of the war be found at some other stage. The bad thing about it is that frozen conflicts do get hot again, so there is always a risk. But the good thing is that there is no more bloodshed, at least for the foreseeable future, without agreeing to Russia's sovereignty over the occupied territories or guaranteeing that Ukraine would never become a NATO member, let alone acquiescing to Russia's more ludicrous demands, such as forcing former socialist states, such as Poland, Czechia and others, to leave NATO. But is Russia going to agree to these terms? At least public messaging coming from the Kremlin creates considerable doubts about it. On the one hand, Russian media reports that the Kremlin is preparing its officials for an end to the war in Ukraine. The idea is to sell the control over occupied territories and purported success in denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine as success to the Russian public. On the other hand, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has reiterated Russia's harsh demands, such as recognition of Russia's control over Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, guarantees that Ukraine will never be a NATO member, and Western military bases will never be established in Ukraine, while Ukraine is to accept Russia as one of its security guarantors. Moreover, Putin has reportedly also explicitly rejected the possibility of Ukraine's later membership to NATO. So there are a lot of unknowns at this point. will Putin accept American security guarantees to Ukraine? Given the recent Russian advances on the battlefield, will Putin accept the freezing of the war along the current front lines, which will really be a meager result for hundreds of thousands of losses suffered by the Russian army? Consider recent claims about Russian losses coming from the West. Again, you may choose to think they are exaggerated, but it is beyond reasonable doubt that the Russian campaign has been extremely taxing on the country in terms of manpower losses and financial expenditure. According to the Pentagon chief Lloyd Austin, Russia has already spent over $200 billion on the war in Ukraine, while suffering at least 700,000 casualties. Trump has suggested 600,000 losses. Zelensky has claimed 198,000 dead and more than 550,000 wounded. According to Trump's envoy Kellogg, Russia has lost 5 times more soldiers than Ukraine. It is true that Russia has the strategic initiative, but they have already probably exceeded 500,000 losses and may be approaching 1 million very soon. Presumably at one point, the Russian public may start asking questions. Were all these losses for scorched earth, most of which will be uninhabitable in the near future? Putin's resounding defeat in Syria and economic challenges indicate that for all its wealth of resources, Russia is stretching itself and their war of attrition is taking its toll. Having said that, Ukraine, which has a smaller population and is suffering from mass destruction of its infrastructure, is in a very tough spot too. The American media has reported that Ukraine has lost 80,000 soldiers. The Ukrainian military correspondent Yuri Butazov claims that the Ukrainian chief of staff has reported to Zelensky about 105,000 dead and missing soldiers. Trump suggests 400,000 losses, which is quite similar to Zelensky's claim of 43,000 dead and 370,000 wounded soldiers. The rate of casualties can be debated, but it is clear that both sides are struggling. Hence, a ceasefire or a peace deal may be getting more and more realistic. Lastly, let's look at the visually documented equipment losses suffered by both parties as of December 30th, according to the Oryx blog. Russia has lost at least 3,662 tanks, 8,650 vehicles, 297 command posts and communication stations, 1,409 artillery systems and vehicles, 448 multiple rocket launchers, 134 aircraft, and 148 helicopters. Ukraine has lost at least 1,012 tanks, 3,506 vehicles, 27 command posts and communication stations, 694 artillery systems and vehicles, 80 multiple rocket launchers, 102 aircraft, and 50 helicopters. Further updates on the war in Ukraine are on the way. If you don't want to miss them, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.